Welcome back, guys. Let's continue looking at abiotic factors. We've looked at the edaphic factors. Let's move on to the other factors that influence the living organisms in their environment. So the next group of factors are the climatic factors. The first factor we're looking at is light, and we know that light is important for one of the most crucial processes of photosynthesis. We often tend to focus just on plants. However, it's important that we recognize that even animals are affected by light. So let's try and understand the importance of light to living organisms. So light is essential for the process of photosynthesis. We know that our producers rely directly on that light. However, light may be a limiting factor because sometimes when we have excessive light, it may damage plant tissue. So there are different types of plants that require different amounts of light. And so we have plants that use a lot of light during the day and some that prefer to have less light. And so based on that, we can have an overview of the impact of light. So the length of the day, which is the duration of exposure, affects when a plant flowers. We know that some plants will flower when the days are short, and we refer to them as your short day plants. Okay, we'll look at those in a little while others flower when the days are much longer in summer. So let's look at that. Based on that, we have our short day plants, and these require shorter durations of exposure to light. Some of these include your strawberry plants as well as your poinsettia. The others would be plants that prefer long day plants, so they require long exposure to light. Examples of these include the carnations and some of your spinach plants. However, we have our day neutral plants, example the sunflower plants and even your rose plants that get along through the day with whatever sunlight they're exposed to. So not very sensitive to sun, provided that they get most of the sun during a day, they would be sufficient in terms of producing these beautiful flowers. We also know that the light intensity may affect the opening and closing of flowers and leaves. So here is the image of the evening primrose, and these tend to open up towards the evening when the light intensity decreases. So they're quite sensitive to light. Some flowers, such as the figgies, they close when the light intensity decreases, and others, such as the evening primrose, open when the light intensity increases. So these plants tend to open up when the light intensity increases, and your primroses tend to open up when the light intensity decreases. Again, these plants are sensitive to light, and that affects how they grow. The next climatic factor is temperature. Guys, as we experience different temperatures, we know that animals also are affected. Plants also are affected. It also affects the growth of seeds. So temperature plays an important role in influencing living organisms. So the temperature that plants and animals are exposed to varies significantly between night and day, and even between seasons. We know that in certain areas, such as deserts, they experience hot days and cold nights. We also know that there are seasonal changes from summer to winter where the temperatures fluctuate significantly. So some animals and your herbivores, such as the ones that consume large amounts of plant material, survive in winters while others migrate to warmer areas. And this is essentially to look for either food that is more available during the winter seasons or to avoid the harsh environmental temperatures that may be experienced due to a decrease in the temperature or change in season. We also know that some plants lose their parts above the ground and remain dormant underground in the form of bulbs, tubers, and rhizomes. And this is a mechanism where they store the energy in these structures and survive the cold, unfavorable seasons and then germinate during the next season. So we know that winter is very hostile in certain environments where some plants cannot withstand the extremely cold temperatures, and they do this by forming structures that allow them to survive. So your bulbs are storage structures, your corms, such as your garlic plants, your rhizomes and your gingers, and even your runners, as well as your tubers, such as the ones we see in potatoes and yams, are all structures that allow plants to be able to survive some of the changes in temperature and allow them to reproduce when temperatures are conducive during the spring seasons. The next climatic factor is water, and water is a vital for all living organisms. Plants are adapted to this with regards to the availability of water into three groups. your hydrophytes, your mesophytes, and your xerophytes. And that's based on the availability of water. Let's look at your hydrophytes. So the word hydro refers to water, and so these are plants that are adapted to living and growing in an abundance of water. So your water lilies and your water hyacinths are plants that grow predominantly in water. The next group are your mesophytes. So the mesophytes are plants that grow in areas with moderate amounts of water supply. Most of your fruit trees, your wheat and your maize that you see growing around are plants that are generally your mesophytes. So when you go out into your garden and you see these plants, they require moderate amounts of water. However, we also have the xerophytes. And xerophytes are plants that are adapted to growing in extremely dry conditions. And these are often found in dry, arid, desert conditions. And so these include the cacti as well as your succulents. Here you can see an image showing you some hydrophytes here, where you see these water lilies growing, and they are obviously adapted to being able to survive in these. So they have a thin cuticle, in fact absence at all, because if at all, because they don't need to conserve water. They have a very underdeveloped root system because they rely on the water and they easily absorb the water from the bottom of their leaves. These are your succulents, and these are plants that have thick, fleshy leaves that are able to store water and often seen in dry, arid, hostile conditions. And so your xerophytes usually have, if you look at these are your cacti and different types of cactus plants. They have thick, fleshy leaves that can absorb and store water to survive during extremely dry weather. They often have leaves that are reduced to thorns and very small leaves, as you notice here. And these leaves reduce the surface area for the loss of water. They often have a thick cuticle with a sunken stomata. So the upper layers have a thick, waxy cuticle, and you will notice that in your aloe plants where a white layer forms, and that's the thick cuticle that actually prevents the transpirational loss. On their lower surfaces, they have the stomata that are sunken into the leaf, and that again reduces the transpiration rate during the day. What's also key is that they have well-developed root systems that grow deep into the soil so that they can extract water from the lowest parts of the soil. So these are adaptations of plants that are xerophytic to an area where the water availability is significantly less. Animals are also adapted in many different ways with regards to the availability of water. Here we have got an image of a kangaroo rat, which basically never drinks water, but it gets most of its water from the food. And so that's an adaptation that it has, where it lives in dry, arid conditions and relies on the food that it gets to acquire water. Desert animals such as the camels, they excrete large amounts of urine that is very crystallized. So you'll find that the urine forms crystals, and this is to retain much water as possible. So these are adaptations of animals for living in dry conditions. We know that insects have a large, thick exoskeleton, and that prevents again the dehydration of organisms. We know earthworms rely on moist, damp soils. So again, the availability of water can influence organisms significantly, and accordingly they have adapted to living in these different environments. The next factor we're looking at is atmospheric gases, and we know that the air that we inhale consists of different components, and these all influence life forms. So air is made up of 78% of nitrogen, 21% of oxygen, 0.04% of carbon dioxide, and we have approximately slightly less than 1% of the other gases, which include argon and some of the other gases. And collectively, that atmospheric composition of gases influence how organisms survive. So all living organisms except your anaerobic bacteria require oxygen for cellular respiration. Anaerobic bacteria are those bacteria that can survive in environments with no oxygen, and so they have the ability to use carbon dioxide for cellular processes. So green plants need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Your terrestrial organisms require oxygen, and that oxygen is used for cellular respiration, and that is their ability to be able to use the oxygen to produce energy in the form of ATP. And so we need that environment producing large amounts of oxygen. The next factor we're looking at is wind. And wind again influences several factors. So the movement of air currents in the atmosphere is known as wind. Wind is very important for the following reason. It will assist in the process of pollination. Plants require pollination to occur in order to be able to survive and produce more. So pollinators are organisms or agents that transfer pollen. So wind is a significant pollinator of plants. It also aids in the dispersal of light seeds or fruits. So wind allows for the dispersal of seeds, and you often find in your pine, you find the seeds are released, and these seeds have adapted to being able to disperse from the plant that has produced them. Fruits are often, your smaller fruits are often carried by wind, and this allows for the dispersal of plants into a variety of different habitats. We know that wind transports rain, hail, snow, and sand in the atmosphere. So wind often carries the rain, it carries some of the snow, and so it plays a significant distribution of some of the other abiotic factors. Wind, however, accelerates the process of evaporation and transpiration, and thus resulting in living organisms losing water more rapidly. And so you'll find that often wind influences how plants have grown, and in that way you'll find there are certain structures that allow them to reduce the loss of water from evaporation. And so we see the development of thick thorns, reduced leaves, or thick fleshy stems as you would see them in the aloe plants. The next factor that influences biotic factors are your physiographic factors. As I mentioned earlier on, this refers to the lay of the land, and there are three factors that we look at: aspect, slope, and altitude. Let's have a quick overview of what aspect is. Aspect is the direction in which an area faces the sun. And so this is significant when we talk about the access of plants to light. So the aspect is the direction which an area faces the direction of the sun. So if you look at this illustration, you'll find that when we have the sun coming in from the northern hemisphere, the slopes on the southern side are much cooler than the slopes on the northern side. So we would find the growth of plants very different in this region compared to the south-facing slopes. And so in South Africa, the sun shines from the north, and this means that the north-facing slopes are exposed to the direct rays of sun for much longer periods during the day when compared to the south-facing slopes. Okay, so this means that the north-facing slopes will be hotter and drier, while the south-facing slopes will be much more cooler and moist. And so this in turn affects the growth of plants on the north sides and the south sides. And that factor we refer to as is called the aspect of the environment. Here we can see an image that shows you a little valley which has a slope that is experiencing significantly much more light than the slope on this area. And this is a clear image showing you how the vegetation varies in that area. So you'll find that this influences the growth of plants. The concept of slope of the land is how steep or the gradient of the area. And this influences how the water flows between the different slopes. So soil on steep slopes tend to be relatively infertile because of these steep slopes, the water runs off significantly faster and hence does not allow for the retention of the nutrients. And so this would be significant in areas that are mountainous or hilly. The last factor we look at is altitude, and altitude is again the height above sea level. And what we know about altitude is that as altitude changes, we know that it affects the atmospheric pressure, which decreases, the temperature decreases, as well as the oxygen levels decrease. So when we talk about altitude, we know that as altitude increases, it's going to affect the availability of oxygen, it's going to be much cooler, it's going to be greater in terms of atmospheric pressure. In turn, this means that all other living organisms inhabiting these areas will be affected. Guys, as we wrap this segment up, we've looked at the three factors that influence light. We've looked at the edaphic factors, we've looked at the physiographic factors, and then we've looked at the climatic factors. It's important that we recognize that all three of these abiotic factors influence the biotic components significantly. It's interesting that we noted that many of our living organisms have adapted in their unique ways to be able to survive in their environments. You've been a fantastic audience, guys. We've looked at abiotic components. I trust that you guys have enjoyed the lesson. I wish you well. Have a bioleka day. See you soon.